Hey everyone, before we dive into tonight's journey through medieval childhood, take a moment to hit that like button if you're genuinely interested in these stories from the past. And don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy exploring history's forgotten corners. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your world. It's always fascinating to see how this community spans across time zones. Now settle in, maybe dim the lights, and let's step back nearly 1,000 years to discover what it was really like to grow up in an age of castles, plagues, and unimaginable hardship. When you think about medieval childhood, you might imagine young pages training to become knights, or perhaps children playing happily in castle courtyards while minstrels sang cheerful songs. The reality was far harsher and infinitely more complex. Medieval childhood wasn't a gentle introduction to the world. It was a brutal test of survival that began the moment you drew your first breath. If you were fortunate enough to survive birth, which was itself a dangerous gamble, you entered a world where childhood as we understand it today simply didn't exist. The concept of childhood as a protected, innocent phase of life was completely foreign to medieval society. Children weren't seen as precious beings who needed years of nurturing and education. They were viewed as small adults, incomplete perhaps, but expected to contribute to family survival from the earliest possible age. There were no toy stores, no playgrounds, no birthday parties with cake and presents. Instead, there were endless chores, adult responsibilities thrust upon tiny shoulders, and the constant, looming presence of death. Let's start with the most sobering reality of medieval childhood. The chances of actually surviving to see your 5th birthday were terrifyingly slim. Infant mortality rates hovered somewhere between 40 and 60%, meaning that in any given family, half the children born would never make it past their toddler years. Parents, hardened by this brutal reality, often waited years before becoming emotionally attached to their children. It wasn't cruelty, it was psychological survival. Birth itself was a perilous journey. Medieval women gave birth in their homes, attended by midwives whose knowledge came from tradition rather than medical training. There were no sterile conditions, no pain relief, no emergency procedures if something went wrong. Many women died in childbirth, leaving newborns to face the world without their mothers. Those babies who survived the trauma of birth entered a world where every day presented new threats to their fragile existence. Disease stalked medieval children like a hungry wolf. The Black Death, which swept through Europe repeatedly during the 14th century, showed particular cruelty toward the young. But even without plague, children faced constant threats from smallpox, measles, whooping cough, and dozens of other illnesses that modern medicine has largely conquered. A simple fever could become a death sentence. A cut could turn septic and claim a life within days. Malnutrition weakened young bodies, making them even more vulnerable to disease. Medieval diets were monotonous and often inadequate, especially for growing children. Peasant families survived primarily on bread, porridge, and whatever vegetables they could grow. Meat was a rare luxury, milk was scarce, and fresh fruits were seasonal treats. Children's bodies, already fighting to grow and develop, struggled against constant hunger and nutritional deficiencies. The physical environment itself posed countless dangers. Medieval homes were death traps for curious children. Open hearths burned constantly, creating risks of burns and house fires. Wells had no protective barriers. Tools and weapons lay scattered about. Animals, both domestic and wild, shared living spaces with families, bringing disease and the occasional violent encounter. For those children who managed to survive their earliest years, life quickly became a series of adult responsibilities. By age 7, most children were expected to contribute meaningfully to their family's survival. This wasn't gentle guidance into responsibility. It was immediate, often back-breaking labour that would shape every aspect of their remaining childhood. Peasant children found themselves thrust into agricultural work almost as soon as they could walk steadily. Boys learned to tend animals, help with ploughing, and assist in the endless cycle of planting, weeding, and harvesting. Girls mastered the complex skills of food preparation, textile work, and household management. These weren't optional lessons or character-building exercises. They were essential survival skills that families desperately needed. The work was physically demanding and often dangerous. Children helped with harvest in fields where sharp tools were constantly in use. They tended animals that could kick, bite, or trample them. They worked with fire, heavy objects, and toxic substances used in various crafts. Accidents were common, and medical treatment was primitive at best. Urban children faced their own unique challenges. In medieval towns and cities, children as young as 7 or 8 were apprenticed to craftsmen, beginning decades-long journeys to master trades. These apprenticeships weren't gentle learning experiences. They were grueling periods of servitude where children worked long hours, endured harsh discipline, and lived away from their families for years at a time. The relationship between apprentices and their masters was complex and often exploitative. Masters had complete authority over their young charges, including the right to physical punishment for perceived failures or disobedience. Some masters treated their apprentices fairly, viewing them as future craftsmen to be nurtured. Others saw them as cheap labour to be worked to exhaustion. Education, as we understand it, was largely non-existent for most medieval children. Literacy was the privilege of the wealthy elite and the clergy. Peasant children learned what they needed to know through direct experience and oral tradition. They absorbed farming techniques by working alongside their parents. They learned social customs through community participation. They discovered religious beliefs through church attendance and family prayers. For the rare children who did receive formal education, the experience was harsh and unforgiving. Medieval schools emphasized rote memorization, strict discipline, and religious instruction. Students spent long hours copying Latin texts they often couldn't fully understand. Physical punishment for academic failures was not just accepted, but expected. The phrase, "spare the rod and spoil the child," wasn't just a saying. It was educational philosophy. Noble children received different treatment, but their lives were hardly carefree. Boys were often sent away from home at age 7 to begin training as pages in other noble households. This separation from family was considered essential for proper character development and political alliance building. Girls remained closer to home, but faced intense preparation for their eventual roles as wives and mothers in arranged marriages. The training of noble children was rigorous and demanding. Boys learned warfare, hunting, courtly etiquette, and basic literacy. Girls mastered household management, needlework, music, and the complex social skills necessary for navigating noble society. Both boys and girls understood that their personal desires were secondary to family honour and political necessity. Play, when it existed at all, was vastly different from modern childhood recreation. Medieval children created entertainment from whatever materials they could find. They carved simple toys from wood scraps, fashioned dolls from rags, and invented games using stones, sticks, and their imagination. But playtime was limited and often interrupted by the demands of work and survival. Religious instruction permeated every aspect of medieval childhood. Children learned that life on earth was a test of faith, that suffering was divinely ordained, and that their primary goal should be preparing for the afterlife. This religious framework helped explain the harsh realities they faced daily, but it also added psychological pressure to their already difficult lives. The concept of adolescence didn't exist in medieval society. Children transitioned directly from childhood to adult responsibilities without the gradual progression we consider normal today. Girls often married in their early teens, immediately taking on the roles of wives and potential mothers. Boys assumed adult work responsibilities and social obligations as soon as they were physically capable. This abrupt transition created unique psychological challenges. Children who had barely survived their own dangerous childhoods suddenly found themselves responsible for protecting and nurturing the next generation. Young mothers faced the same terrifying mortality rates that had threatened their own survival. Young fathers carried the weight of family survival on shoulders that had only recently outgrown childhood frailty. The social structure of medieval society meant that most children inherited their parents' social status and occupations. A peasant's child would become a peasant. A craftsman's child would learn the family trade. Social mobility was extremely rare, and children understood from an early age that their futures were largely predetermined by the circumstances of their birth. This rigid social structure created both security and limitation. Children knew exactly what was expected of them and what their adult lives would look like, but they also knew that dreams of escape or advancement were largely futile. Their energy was better spent mastering the skills they would need within their predetermined social roles. Weather and seasons played enormous roles in shaping medieval childhood experiences. Winter brought not just cold and discomfort, but genuine threats to survival. Children helped their families prepare for months of potential starvation, fuel shortages, and isolation. Spring brought relief, but also the exhausting work of planting and the anxiety of hoping for good harvests. The rhythm of medieval childhood followed natural cycles rather than academic calendars. Children worked hardest during harvest seasons, regardless of their age or physical development. They endured hunger during lean winter months and celebrated during rare times of abundance. Their bodies and minds adapted to these cycles, creating a relationship with nature that modern children can barely imagine. Medieval children also lived with constant awareness of their own mortality. Death wasn't hidden from them or explained away with gentle euphemisms. They attended funerals regularly, helped prepare bodies for burial, and understood that life was fragile and often brief. This awareness shaped their perspectives in ways that seem almost incomprehensible to modern sensibilities. Yet perhaps most haunting of all was how medieval children learned to navigate a world where violence was woven into the fabric of daily existence. They witnessed public executions as community events, watched animals slaughtered for food, and saw disputes settled through physical confrontation. This wasn't considered traumatic. It was simply preparation for adult life in a harsh world. The sounds that filled a medieval child's day were vastly different from what modern children experience. Instead of television shows or video games, they heard the constant bleating of goats, the clatter of wooden wheels on cobblestone, the rhythmic pounding of grain being ground by hand. Church bells marked the hours, calling communities to prayer and announcing deaths, births, and important events. Medieval children developed an acute sensitivity to these sounds because their survival often depended on it. They learned to distinguish between the normal creaking of their wooden homes and the sounds that might signal structural collapse. They could identify approaching strangers by the rhythm of hoofbeats or footsteps. They knew which animal calls meant danger and which meant dinner. The smells of medieval childhood were equally distinctive and often overwhelming. Open sewers ran through city streets. Animal waste accumulated in yards and byways. Unwashed bodies, cooking fires, and rotting food created a sensory landscape that would be unbearable to modern sensitivities. Children grew up breathing air thick with smoke from wood fires, learning to sleep despite the acrid sting in their eyes and throats. Personal hygiene was a luxury few medieval children could afford. Baths were rare events, often seasonal rather than regular occurrences. Clothing was worn until it literally fell apart, then patched and mended repeatedly. Children learned to live with lice, fleas, and various skin conditions as normal parts of existence. Clean water was precious and often contaminated, making illness a constant companion. The texture of medieval childhood was rough in every sense. Children slept on straw mattresses that poked and scratched. Their clothes were made from coarse fabrics that chafed against tender skin. Their hands developed thick calluses from constant manual labour before they reached their 10th birthdays. Softness was almost unknown in their daily experiences. Food, when available, was often barely palatable by modern standards. Children ate bread, that was frequently stale or mouldy. Vegetables were typically overcooked to mush. Meat, when they could get it, was heavily salted for preservation, making it tough and almost inedibly salty. Fresh fruit was a seasonal miracle that children savoured with an intensity modern kids reserve for candy. The preparation of food was itself a dangerous activity that children learned through necessity. They helped tend fires that could easily burn down entire neighbourhoods. They worked with sharp knives, boiling water, and heavy iron pots that could cause serious injury if mishandled. Cooking accidents were common, and the resulting burns or cuts could easily become infected and life-threatening. Medieval children also lived without any concept of privacy. Entire families shared single rooms, often with animals, and sometimes with boarders or extended relatives. Children witnessed every aspect of adult life, from intimate conversations to marital relations, to the harsh realities of illness and death. There were no separate spaces for childhood innocence to flourish. The legal system treated children as miniature adults from a surprisingly early age. By 7 years old, children could be held legally responsible for crimes. They could be imprisoned, fined, or even executed for serious offences. The concept of juvenile justice didn't exist. A child who stole bread faced the same potential punishments as an adult thief. This harsh legal reality meant that children learned very early to navigate complex social and legal boundaries. They understood that their actions could have devastating consequences, not just for themselves, but for their entire families. A child's misbehaviour could result in family financial ruin or social disgrace. Marriage and sexual maturity arrived with shocking suddenness in medieval childhood. Girls could be legally married as young as 12, boys at 14. These weren't romantic unions, but economic and political arrangements designed to benefit families and communities. Children had no say in these decisions and often met their spouses for the first time on their wedding days. The transition from child to spouse was jarring and often traumatic. Young brides found themselves responsible for managing households, bearing children, and navigating complex family politics almost overnight. Young grooms inherited enormous responsibilities for family welfare and community standing while barely out of childhood themselves. Pregnancy and childbirth for young medieval wives carried all the same deadly risks their mothers had faced. Many died in their first attempts at childbirth, never reaching full adulthood. Those who survived often found themselves pregnant repeatedly, their bodies worn down by constant childbearing before they reached their 20th birthdays. The cycle of medieval childhood was thus brutally short and relentlessly demanding. Children who survived infancy faced immediate adult responsibilities. Those who survived to adolescence were thrust into marriage and parenthood. The carefree, protected childhood we consider normal today was not just absent, but literally unimaginable to medieval society. Medieval children also lived with supernatural beliefs that shaped their understanding of the world in profound ways. They grew up believing in demons, angels, magical creatures, and divine intervention as everyday realities. Every unexplained event, from sudden illness to crop failure, was attributed to supernatural causes. This worldview provided explanations for the harsh realities they faced, but also added layers of fear and superstition to their daily lives. Children learned elaborate rituals and prayers designed to protect them from evil influences. They carried blessed objects, avoided certain places during specific times, and followed complex behavioural codes believed to influence their spiritual welfare. These weren't optional cultural practices, but essential survival strategies in their understanding of the world. The medieval child's relationship with nature was both intimate and terrifying. They lived much closer to natural cycles than modern children, understanding weather patterns, animal behaviours, and seasonal changes with remarkable precision. But nature was also seen as dangerous and unpredictable, filled with threats that could destroy families and communities without warning. Children learned to read natural signs that could mean the difference between life and death. They knew which plants were edible and which were poisonous. They could predict weather changes by observing cloud formations, animal behaviours, and atmospheric conditions. They understood that their survival depended on working with natural forces rather than trying to control them. The tools and technology available to medieval children were primitive, but required sophisticated skills to use effectively. A simple task like making fire demanded knowledge, patience, and practice that modern children can barely comprehend. Children mastered complex crafts using basic tools, developing hand-eye coordination and problem-solving abilities through constant practice and necessity. Even their toys and games reflected the harsh realities of medieval life. Children played with miniature versions of their adult tools, practicing skills they would need for survival. Their games often mimicked adult activities like farming, crafts, or warfare. Play was never entirely separate from preparation for adult responsibilities. The medical care available to medieval children was a mixture of folk wisdom, religious ritual, and dangerous experimentation. Parents treated childhood illnesses with herbal remedies that sometimes helped but often made conditions worse. Serious injuries or diseases were often seen as divine punishment or supernatural affliction, leading to treatments that focused more on spiritual healing than physical intervention. Children learned to endure pain without complaint because medical relief was rarely available. They developed remarkable tolerance for discomfort and learned to function despite chronic conditions that would be easily treated today. Their bodies adapted to malnutrition, parasite infestations, and various infections as normal states of existence. The emotional landscape of medieval childhood was shaped by constant loss and uncertainty. Children regularly experienced the deaths of siblings, parents, and friends. They learned not to form deep attachments too quickly and to accept grief as a normal part of life. This emotional restraint wasn't coldness, but a necessary adaptation to a world where love often led to heartbreak. Despite these harsh realities, medieval children did experience moments of joy and wonder. They found delight in simple pleasures that modern children might overlook. A successful harvest, a rare treat of honey, a warm day after a harsh winter. These small victories were celebrated with an intensity born from understanding how precious and fleeting such moments could be. The storytelling traditions that surrounded medieval children were rich with moral lessons, supernatural elements, and practical wisdom. Children learned about their world through tales passed down through generations, stories that explained natural phenomena, taught social values, and provided entertainment during long winter nights. These stories were their primary form of education about history, geography, and human nature. Medieval children lived in a world where the boundary between reality and imagination was much more fluid than it is today. They grew up believing in magic, miracles, and divine intervention as everyday possibilities. This worldview made their harsh reality more bearable by suggesting that supernatural help might arrive at any moment, but it also added layers of fear and superstition to their daily experiences. The physical development of medieval children followed different patterns than modern childhood development. Poor nutrition often stunted growth, while constant physical labour built strength and endurance at early ages. Children developed adult-level skills and responsibilities while their bodies were still growing, creating unique physical and psychological stresses that shaped their development in profound ways. The clothing that medieval children wore tells its own story of hardship and practicality. Forget about closets full of options or seasonal wardrobes. Most children owned perhaps 2 sets of clothing if they were fortunate. One outfit for daily wear, patched and repatched until it resembled a patchwork quilt, more than original fabric, and perhaps one slightly better set reserved for church or special occasions. The concept of children's clothing sized specifically for growing bodies didn't exist. Instead, children wore miniature versions of adult garments, or more commonly, hand-me-downs, that had been altered to fit their smaller frames. The fabrics themselves were rough and scratchy by modern standards. Wool was the primary material for most families, but it was coarse, unwashed wool that retained its natural oils and odours. Linen, when available, was slightly more comfortable, but still far from the soft cotton fabrics we associate with children's clothing today. These garments were designed for durability, not comfort, and children learned to ignore the constant irritation of rough fabric against their skin. Shoes were a luxury many medieval children lived without entirely. Those fortunate enough to have footwear typically owned wooden clogs or leather shoes that were passed down through multiple siblings. The shoes were rarely a proper fit, leading to foot problems that persisted throughout their lives. Most children simply went barefoot, developing thick, calloused soles that could handle rough terrain, sharp stones, and extreme temperatures. The process of getting dressed each morning was itself a complex ritual. Medieval clothing involved multiple layers, ties, and fastenings that required assistance, especially for younger children. But with entire families sharing cramped living spaces and everyone rushing to begin daily chores, children learned to dress themselves quickly and efficiently from a remarkably early age. There was no time for dawdling or fashion choices. Cleanliness, as we understand it, was an impossible dream for medieval children. Bathing was rare, expensive, and often considered dangerous to one's health. Most children went weeks or even months without a proper bath. Instead, they might wash their hands and faces occasionally with cold water if water was available. Their hair became matted and infested with lice, which was considered so normal that elaborate social rituals developed around delousing sessions. The seasonal changes that modern children eagerly anticipate brought terror to medieval families. Winter wasn't a time for snow days and hot chocolate. It was a period of potential starvation, when stored food supplies dwindled and fresh provisions became impossible to obtain. Children learned to recognize the signs of approaching winter with dread, knowing that their survival depended on careful rationing of resources and the hope that they had stored enough to last until spring. During these harsh winter months, children's daily routines contracted dramatically. The focus shifted entirely to conservation of heat and food. Families huddled together in the warmest parts of their homes, often sharing body heat with their livestock. Children learned to move as little as possible to preserve energy, spending long hours in semi-dormant states that helped them survive on reduced food rations. The concept of seasonal clothing changes was foreign to medieval children. They wore the same basic garments year-round, simply adding or removing layers as weather demanded. In winter, this meant piling on every piece of fabric they owned, creating bulky, restrictive outfits that made movement difficult but provided crucial insulation. In summer, they peeled down to the minimum socially acceptable layers, but even then remained more covered than modern children would find comfortable. Food preservation dominated much of medieval childhood activity, especially as seasons changed. Children learned complex techniques for drying, salting, smoking, and storing various foods. They spent countless hours helping to prepare for winter by processing the harvest, learning skills that literally meant the difference between life and death. These weren't cooking lessons or fun family activities. They were intensive training sessions in survival techniques. The tools that medieval children used in their daily work were adult-sized implements that they had to master despite their small stature. Sharp knives, heavy hammers, dangerous agricultural equipment all became familiar objects that children learned to handle with deadly seriousness. Accidents were common, and the resulting injuries often led to permanent disabilities or death. Yet there was no alternative. The family's survival depended on every member contributing their maximum effort, regardless of age or physical development. Medieval children also served as the communication network for their communities. In an age before widespread literacy or efficient communication systems, children often carried messages between households, villages, and even distant locations. They memorized complex verbal messages, learned to navigate dangerous terrain alone, and took on responsibilities that required remarkable maturity and reliability. The games that medieval children played often reflected the violent realities of their world. Mock battles, hunting games, and competitions that mimicked adult warfare were common forms of entertainment. These activities served multiple purposes. They provided rare moments of fun, but they also prepared children for the violent world they would inherit as adults. Play and preparation were inseparably intertwined. Religious observances consumed enormous amounts of time in medieval children's lives. They attended multiple services each day, participated in lengthy seasonal celebrations, and followed complex rules about fasting, prayer, and behaviour that governed every aspect of their existence. These weren't optional activities, but mandatory community obligations that shaped their understanding of proper conduct and social expectations. The relationship between medieval children and their parents was fundamentally different from modern family dynamics. Emotional displays were discouraged, physical affection was rare, and the parent-child bond was seen primarily as an economic and social arrangement rather than an emotional connection. Parents' love was expressed through provision, and their children certainly, but that protection rather than the emotional intimacy we consider normal today. Discipline was swift, harsh, and physical. Children expected to be beaten for infractions both large and small. This wasn't considered abuse, but necessary character formation. The phrase about sparing the rod wasn't just a saying, but a fundamental philosophy of child rearing. Children learned to accept physical punishment without protest and to modify their behaviour to avoid further correction. The transition from childhood to adolescence was marked not by gradual physical and emotional changes, but by sudden assumption of adult responsibilities. There was no teenage period of experimentation or identity formation. Children moved directly from childhood dependency to adult obligations, often within the span of a single season or significant family event. Marriage preparations began remarkably early in medieval society. Girls learned household management skills from toddlerhood, understanding that their future value as wives depended on their ability to run complex domestic operations. Boys learned trades and developed the economic capabilities necessary to support families. These weren't distant future preparations, but immediate practical training for roles they might assume within just a few years. The legal status of medieval children was complex and often contradictory. They could be held responsible for crimes and punished as adults, yet they had no rights to property, education, or self-determination. They existed in a legal limbo where they bore adult responsibilities without adult privileges, creating situations that modern legal systems would find incomprehensible. Death was such a constant presence in medieval children's lives that they developed elaborate rituals and beliefs around mortality. They learned detailed procedures for preparing bodies for burial, understood complex religious concepts about afterlife and salvation, and accepted their own potential death as a daily possibility, rather than a distant, abstract concept. The seasonal rhythms that governed medieval life created unique psychological pressures for children. The anxiety of winter preparation, the exhaustion of harvest seasons, the depression of long dark months, all became part of their emotional landscape from early childhood. They learned to regulate their emotions according to seasonal demands, suppressing individual needs for the greater requirements of family survival. Medieval children also lived with constant awareness of their social position and the rigid boundaries that governed their interactions with others. They learned complex rules about deference to social superiors, appropriate behaviour with peers, and the harsh consequences of overstepping social boundaries. These lessons were reinforced through daily interactions and occasional brutal reminders of their place in the social hierarchy. The educational experiences available to medieval children varied dramatically based on social class, but even wealthy children received instruction that would seem harsh and limited by modern standards. Learning was based on rote memorization, physical punishment for errors, an endless repetition of basic concepts. Creativity and individual expression were not just discouraged, but actively suppressed as dangerous distractions from proper learning. The few children who did learn to read and write found themselves in possession of skills that were both valuable and dangerous. Literacy could open doors to better positions and social advancement, but it also exposed children to ideas and information that authorities considered potentially corrupting or heretical. Reading was as much about learning what not to think as it was about acquiring knowledge. The medical treatments available to medieval children often caused more harm than the original ailments. Bloodletting, purging, and various herbal remedies were administered based on theories that had little connection to actual human physiology. Children learned to endure these treatments stoically, understanding that medical intervention was often more ordeal than cure. The relationship between medieval children and animals was intimate and complex. They lived alongside livestock, understanding animal behaviour with remarkable sophistication. Yet they also participated in animal slaughter, learned to view animals as resources rather than companions, and developed emotional detachment from creatures that might be killed for food or economic necessity. The sounds that filled medieval children's environments were entirely different from modern childhood soundscapes. Instead of electronic entertainment, they heard the constant noise of manual labour, animal sounds, and human voices engaged in the business of survival. These sounds created a rhythm of life that was tied directly to productive activity rather than leisure or entertainment. Medieval children learned navigation and orientation skills that modern GPS-dependent adults would find remarkable. They could find their way across unmarked terrain, predict weather changes from subtle environmental cues, and identify edible or useful plants and materials from vast natural inventories they carried in their memories. The concept of privacy was completely foreign to medieval children. They shared sleeping spaces, witnessed adult conversations and activities, and learned to function in environments where personal space and individual quiet time simply didn't exist. They developed social skills and emotional regulation techniques designed for constant group living rather than individual reflection. The tools for personal hygiene available to medieval children were primitive and often ineffective. Wooden combs for hair, rough cloths for washing, and basic soaps made from animal fat and ash were the extent of their grooming resources. They learned to maintain personal cleanliness as much as possible within these severe limitations, but modern standards of hygiene were literally impossible to achieve. The relationship between medieval children and food was shaped by constant scarcity and seasonal variation. They learned to eat whatever was available without complaint, to appreciate foods that modern children would find repulsive, and to understand that pickiness about food was a luxury that could literally lead to starvation. Meals were not social occasions, but fuel stops designed to provide energy for continued work. The sleep patterns of medieval children followed natural light cycles rather than artificial schedules. They went to bed when darkness fell and rose at dawn, with their sleep frequently interrupted by household responsibilities, animal care, or family crises. The concept of sleeping through the night without interruption was rarely achievable in medieval living conditions. Medieval children also learned to cope with constant physical discomfort as a normal part of existence. Hunger, cold, minor injuries, and various ailments were expected parts of daily life, rather than problems to be immediately solved. They developed remarkable tolerance for discomfort and learned to function effectively, despite conditions that would incapacitate modern children. The social networks that medieval children navigated were complex webs of family relationships, community obligations, and economic dependencies. They learned to understand their position within these networks and to fulfill their responsibilities regardless of personal preferences or individual desires. community survival took precedence over individual happiness in ways that modern, individualistic societies can barely comprehend. The relationship between medieval children and authority figures was based on absolute obedience and deference. They learned never to question adult decisions, to accept punishment without protest, and to suppress their own opinions in favour of established authority. This wasn't just social politeness, but survival strategy in societies where challenging authority could have deadly consequences. The seasonal celebrations that punctuated medieval children's lives were rare breaks from constant labour, but even these celebrations involved responsibilities and obligations rather than pure enjoyment. Children participated in community festivals, religious observances, and family gatherings as contributors rather than honoured guests, learning that even celebration required work and social awareness. The economic education of medieval children was immediate and practical rather than theoretical. They learned about trade, value, and resource management through direct participation in family economic activities. They understood concepts like scarcity, investment, and risk through daily experience rather than classroom instruction, developing sophisticated understanding of economic realities that governed their survival. The technological limitations of medieval society meant that children learned to accomplish complex tasks using simple tools and human energy. They developed problem-solving skills, creativity, and resourcefulness that allowed them to achieve remarkable results despite severe technological constraints. Their innovations and adaptations were matters of survival rather than intellectual curiosity. Medieval children lived in a world where supernatural beliefs and practical realities were seamlessly integrated. They learned to protect themselves from evil influences while also mastering practical skills, to pray for divine intervention while also taking concrete action to solve problems. This dual approach to life created a worldview that modern secular societies find difficult to understand, but that provided medieval children with both spiritual comfort and practical guidance for navigating their dangerous world. The geographical knowledge that medieval children possessed was both surprisingly sophisticated and terrifyingly limited. They could navigate local terrain with remarkable precision, identifying landmarks, water sources, and safe passages across miles of countryside. Yet their understanding of the broader world was filled with fantastical beliefs about distant lands populated by monsters, demons, and magical creatures. This combination of practical local knowledge and mythical worldview shaped how they understood their place in both physical and spiritual realms. Medieval children learned to identify dozens of plants and their uses, distinguishing between those that could heal, those that could kill, and those that could provide sustenance during desperate times. This botanical knowledge wasn't academic study, but essential survival information passed down through generations of trial and error. Children who failed to master these distinctions might accidentally poison themselves or miss opportunities for crucial nutrition during famines. The concept of time itself was different for medieval children. They lived by natural rhythms rather than mechanical clocks, understanding time through seasonal changes, animal behaviours, and celestial movements. The day began at sunrise and ended at sunset, with activities flowing according to natural light and weather conditions rather than arbitrary schedules. This created a relationship with time that was both more flexible and more demanding than modern temporal structures. Medieval children also served as crucial links in the oral tradition that preserved their community's history and knowledge. They memorized complex stories, songs, and genealogies that maintained cultural continuity across generations. These weren't entertainment activities, but vital information storage systems in societies that lacked written records. Children who failed to accurately preserve and transmit this information could cause the loss of essential knowledge about everything from farming techniques to family histories. The relationship between medieval children and their own bodies was shaped by ignorance and superstition that modern medical knowledge has largely dispelled. They learned to interpret physical symptoms through religious and supernatural frameworks rather than biological understanding. A fever might be seen as divine punishment rather than immune response. Pain could be viewed as spiritual testing rather than physical injury requiring treatment. Medieval children learned to make and maintain the tools they used in daily life, developing craftsmanship skills that required years of practice to master. They carved wooden implements, wove textiles, forged metal objects, and created the basic necessities of life from raw materials. These weren't hobby activities, but essential skills that determined their ability to survive and contribute to their family's welfare. The social ceremonies that marked important transitions in medieval children's lives were community events that reinforced social bonds and cultural values rather than individual celebrations. Coming-of-age rituals, religious confirmations, and apprenticeship ceremonies served to integrate children into adult society, while also reminding them of their obligations and limitations within that society. Medieval children lived with constant awareness of supernatural threats that modern children would consider fantasy. They learned elaborate protective rituals against evil spirits, understood the significance of various omens and signs, and developed behavioral patterns designed to avoid supernatural punishment. These beliefs weren't optional cultural additions, but essential survival strategies in their understanding of reality. The work songs and rhythmic chants that accompanied medieval children's labour served multiple purposes beyond mere entertainment. These musical traditions helped coordinate group activities, made repetitive work more bearable, and transmitted cultural values and practical information across generations. Children learned complex repertoires of work songs that would accompany them throughout their adult lives. The relationship between medieval children and written language, when they encountered it at all, was one of reverence and mystery rather than casual familiarity. Written words were associated with a religious authority, legal power, and magical properties that made literacy both valuable and potentially dangerous. Children who learned to read and write understood that they were gaining access to forces that could dramatically alter their social position. Medieval children developed remarkable abilities to judge character and intentions through observation of subtle behavioral cues. In societies where deception could mean death and trust was a precious commodity, children learned to read facial expressions, body language, and vocal tones with extraordinary precision. These skills were essential for navigating complex social situations where misplaced trust could have catastrophic consequences. The funeral practices that medieval children participated in from early ages taught them not just about death, but about community solidarity and social hierarchy. They learned their proper places in funeral processions, understood the significance of various mourning rituals, and absorbed lessons about social status through observation of how different deaths were commemorated or ignored. Medieval children also learned to function as part of extended family networks that included not just blood relatives, but also godparents, apprentice masters, and community elders who shared responsibility for their upbringing. These complex relationships created support systems, but also multiple layers of authority and obligation that children had to navigate carefully. The seasonal migration patterns that some medieval families followed in search of work or resources meant that children learned to adapt quickly to new environments and social situations. They developed flexibility and resilience that allowed them to function in unfamiliar communities while maintaining their family connections and cultural identity. The relationship between medieval children and fire was intimate and dangerous in ways that modern children can barely comprehend. They learned to build, maintain, and control fires for cooking, heating, and lighting, understanding that their survival depended on fire management skills, while also knowing that mistakes could destroy their homes and communities. Medieval children learned to preserve food through complex processes of smoking, salting, drying, and fermentation that required precise timing and technique. These skills determined whether families would survive winter months, making food preservation knowledge literally a matter of life and death rather than convenient household management. The trading skills that medieval children developed through participation in local markets taught them negotiation, evaluation of goods, and understanding of currency and barter systems that governed their economic survival. They learned to assess quality, recognize fraud, and conduct business transactions that could significantly impact their family's welfare. Medieval children lived in environments where the boundary between indoor and outdoor space was much more fluid than modern housing creates. Animals shared their living spaces, weather penetrated their shelters, and the natural world was a constant presence rather than something experienced through occasional outdoor activities. The relationship between medieval children and their own sexuality was shaped by religious teachings that emphasized sin and temptation rather than natural development and healthy expression. They learned to view their own bodies with suspicion and shame, understanding physical desires as spiritual challenges to be overcome rather than normal aspects of human development. Medieval children learned to interpret weather patterns and seasonal changes with remarkable accuracy, developing forecasting abilities that allowed their families to make crucial decisions about planting, harvesting, and travel. This meteorological knowledge was based on observation of subtle environmental cues that modern weather prediction technology has largely replaced. The community responsibility systems that governed medieval society meant that children understood their actions reflected not just on themselves, but on their entire families and communities. They learned to consider the broader consequences of individual choices, understanding that personal behaviour could affect community welfare and social standing. Medieval children developed a sophisticated understanding of animal behaviour that allowed them to work effectively with livestock, predict animal needs and responses, and maintain the complex relationships between humans and animals that sustained agricultural societies. This knowledge required constant observation and interaction that created bonds of practical cooperation rather than emotional attachment. The seasonal rhythms of medieval life created psychological patterns in children that differed dramatically from modern childhood development. They learned to endure periods of intense activity followed by forced inactivity, to cope with seasonal depression and anxiety, and to regulate their emotional responses according to environmental demands rather than individual needs. Medieval children also learned to function within hierarchical social structures that determined every aspect of their interactions with others. They understood complex rules about deference, respect, and appropriate behaviour that governed their relationships with people of different social classes, ages, and positions within their communities. The craft knowledge that medieval children absorbed through daily participation in productive activities included not just technical skills, but also aesthetic understanding and cultural traditions that connected their work to broader artistic and spiritual values. They learned that functional objects could also be beautiful, and that craftsmanship carried cultural meaning beyond mere utility. Medieval children lived in acoustic environments dominated by natural sounds and human voices rather than mechanical noise. They learned to interpret complex soundscapes that provided information about weather, animal behaviour, human activities, and potential dangers. Their auditory skills were finely tuned to environmental cues that modern children never learned to recognise. The relationship between medieval children and their clothing was one of scarcity and conservation rather than fashion and self-expression. They learned to care for garments that had to last for years, to repair and modify clothing as they grew, and to understand that their appearance reflected their family's economic status and social position within their community. Medieval children developed remarkable tolerance for physical hardship and discomfort that allowed them to function effectively under conditions that would overwhelm modern children. They learned to work despite hunger, cold, pain, and exhaustion, understanding that their survival and their family's welfare depended on them to continue functioning regardless of personal comfort. The storytelling traditions that surrounded medieval children served not just as entertainment, but as educational systems that transmitted practical knowledge, moral instruction, and cultural values through memorable narratives. These stories taught children about proper behaviour, warned them about dangers, and provided them with frameworks for understanding their world and their place within it. Medieval children learned to recognise and respond to signs of illness in both humans and animals, understanding that early identification of health problems could mean the difference between recovery and death. They developed diagnostic skills based on observation of symptoms and behavioural changes that allowed them to provide basic care and make decisions about when to seek help from community healers. The seasonal celebrations and religious observances that punctuated medieval children's lives provided crucial psychological relief from the constant demands of survival, while also reinforcing community bonds and cultural values. These events taught children about their cultural heritage, provided rare opportunities for joy and festivity, and created shared experiences that bound communities together. Medieval children also learned to navigate the complex political relationships that existed within their communities, understanding alliances, rivalries, and power structures that could affect their family's welfare. They developed diplomatic skills that allowed them to avoid conflicts, build beneficial relationships, and protect their family's interests within competitive social environments. The relationship between medieval children and money was based on scarcity and the understanding that economic resources were finite and precious. They learned to evaluate the worth of goods and services, to make economic decisions that affected their survival, and to understand that financial mistakes could have devastating consequences for their families. Medieval children developed sophisticated understanding of seasonal food cycles that allowed them to identify when different foods would be available, how to prepare for periods of scarcity, and how to make the most of abundant seasons. This knowledge required understanding of plant cycles, animal behaviours, and preservation techniques that ensured their survival through lean periods. The social education of medieval children included learning to recognise and respond appropriately to symbols of authority, status, and power that governed their interactions with others. They learned to read clothing, jewellery, weapons, and other visual cues that indicated social position and determined how they should behave in different social situations. Medieval children lived in environments where privacy was unknown and personal space was minimal, requiring them to develop psychological strategies for maintaining individual identity while functioning as part of tightly knit family and community groups. They learned to find moments of solitude and reflection despite constant social interaction and shared living spaces. The relationship between medieval children and their future was shaped by the understanding that their adult roles were largely predetermined by their birth circumstances and family situation. They learned to accept these limitations while also developing the skills necessary to fulfill their expected roles as effectively as possible within the constraints of their social position. Medieval children developed remarkable abilities to function with minimal resources, creating entertainment, solving problems, and meeting basic needs using whatever materials were available in their immediate environment. This resourcefulness was essential for survival in societies where material abundance was rare and waste was literally unaffordable. The seasonal work patterns that governed medieval life meant that children learned to alternate between periods of intense physical activity and relative rest, developing work rhythms that followed natural cycles rather than artificial schedules. They understood that certain types of work could only be done during specific seasons and learned to make the most of favourable conditions. Medieval children also learned to cope with uncertainty and unpredictability as normal aspects of life, rather than problems to be solved or avoided. They developed psychological resilience that allowed them to function despite not knowing whether their next meal would be available or whether their families would survive the coming winter. The community knowledge systems that medieval children participated in included understanding of local customs, traditions, and practices that governed everything from conflict resolution to resource sharing. They learned their roles within these systems and understood how their behaviour affected community harmony and survival. Medieval children lived with constant awareness of their own vulnerability and dependence on others for survival, creating psychological patterns of cooperation and mutual support that differed dramatically from modern individualistic approaches to life. They learned that their welfare was inseparable from their community's welfare, and that individual success was meaningful only within the context of group survival. The relationship between medieval children and water was fundamentally different from modern experiences with this basic necessity. Clean, safe drinking water was never guaranteed, and children learned early to recognize the subtle signs that distinguished relatively safe water sources from those that could kill them within days. They understood that water from certain wells tasted different during different seasons, that river water downstream from settlements was dangerous, and that even seemingly pure springs could carry invisible threats that would devastate entire families. Children participated in the complex daily rituals of water collection and purification that consumed enormous amounts of time and energy. They learned to carry heavy water containers across difficult terrain, understanding that spilled water represented not just inconvenience, but potential disaster for their families. The techniques for purifying water were primitive and often ineffective, involving boiling when fuel was available, straining through cloth, or simply hoping that prayers and blessed objects would protect them from waterborne illnesses. The bathing practices of medieval children were governed by beliefs that frequent washing was not just unnecessary, but potentially harmful to health. They learned that water could open the body to evil influences, that certain times of year were particularly dangerous for bathing, and that modest amounts of dirt and grime actually provided protection against illness and supernatural threats. When they did bathe, it was often a community activity involving shared water that by modern standards would be considered thoroughly contaminated. Medieval children developed intimate knowledge of textile production that began with understanding how to prepare raw materials and ended with to create complex woven goods. They learned to process flax into linen, wool into yarn, and various plant fibers into usable materials for clothing and household items. This knowledge included understanding which plants could be used for dyes, how to prepare mordants that would make colours permanent, and techniques for creating patterns and designs that served both functional and decorative purposes. The relationship between medieval children and their own names was shaped by religious and social customs that modern children would find restrictive and impersonal. Many children were given names that reflected their parents' hopes for divine protection rather than individual identity. They often shared names with multiple relatives or community members, creating confusion that was resolved through nicknames, physical descriptions, or references to family relationships rather than unique individual identifiers. Medieval children learned to navigate complex gift-giving customs that governed social relationships and community obligations. They understood that presents were not expressions of personal affection, but strategic exchanges that created debts, obligations, and alliances. Children learn to evaluate gifts not just for their immediate utility, but for their social implications, understanding that accepting certain gifts could create expectations and responsibilities that might burden their families for years. The seasonal clothing adjustments that medieval children made involved not just adding or removing layers, but completely restructuring their wardrobes according to available materials and family resources. Summer might mean trading heavier wool garments for lighter linen pieces, while winter required creative layering of every available fabric. Children learn to modify their clothing throughout the seasons, shortening sleeves, patching holes, and repurposing worn garments into new configurations that maximized warmth and durability. Medieval children developed sophisticated understanding of fire safety and management that went far beyond simply avoiding burns. They learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicated when fires were burning too hot, too cold, or consuming the wrong types of fuel. They understood how wind patterns affected fire behavior, how different materials created different types of smoke and flame, and how to control fires for specific purposes like cooking, heating, or signaling. The relationship between medieval children and books, when they encountered written materials at all, was one of reverence bordering on superstition. They learned that books contained powerful knowledge that could change their social status or spiritual condition, but they also understood that unauthorized reading could lead to accusations of heresy or witchcraft. Children who gained access to written materials learned to approach them with caution and respect rather than casual curiosity. Medieval children participated in complex bartering systems that required sophisticated understanding of relative values, seasonal fluctuations in pricing, and the social relationships that governed trade exchanges. They learned to evaluate goods not just for their immediate utility, but for their potential trade value, understanding that items that seemed worthless might become valuable during certain seasons or circumstances. The sleep environments that medieval children experienced were shaped by the need to maximize warmth and security rather than comfort or privacy. They learned to sleep in positions that conserved body heat, to share sleeping spaces with multiple family members and animals, and to remain alert even during sleep for sounds that might indicate danger or emergency. Their sleep patterns were frequently interrupted by household responsibilities, community crises, or the needs of younger siblings and elderly relatives. Medieval children developed remarkable abilities to estimate time and distance without mechanical aids, using natural phenomena like sun positions, shadow lengths, and star configurations to navigate both temporal and spatial challenges. They learned to judge how long various tasks would take, how far they could travel before dark, and when seasonal changes would require adjustments to their daily routines. The relationship between medieval children and their own mortality was immediate and practical rather than abstract or philosophical. They participated in detailed discussions about inheritance, understood the procedures that would be followed if they died, and made practical preparations for their potential deaths that included spiritual preparation and the arrangement of their few possessions. Death was not a distant possibility, but a daily consideration that influenced their decisions and priorities. Medieval children learned to recognize and respond to the complex social signals that governed interactions between different social classes, genders, and age groups. They understood that certain gestures, phrases, and behaviors were appropriate only in specific social contexts, and that mistakes in social protocol could have serious consequences for their families' standing in the community. The seasonal food preservation activities that medieval children participated in required understanding of complex chemical and biological processes that they learned through observation and tradition rather than scientific explanation. They learned to recognize when fermentation was proceeding correctly, when meat was properly cured, and when preserved foods were beginning to spoil. These skills determined whether their families would have adequate nutrition during the lean months of late winter and early spring. Medieval children developed sophisticated understanding of weather prediction based on observation of atmospheric conditions, animal behaviors, and environmental changes that allowed them to make crucial decisions about outdoor activities and seasonal preparations. They learned to read cloud formations, wind patterns, and temperature changes with remarkable accuracy, understanding that incorrect weather predictions could lead to crop failures, travel disasters, or inadequate seasonal preparations. The relationship between medieval children and their own physical development was shaped by ignorance and superstition that created anxiety and confusion about normal growth processes. They learned to view changes in their bodies through religious and supernatural frameworks that emphasize sin, temptation, and spiritual struggle rather than natural biological development. This created psychological pressures that affected their self-perception and social relationships throughout their lives. Medieval children participated in complex community decision-making processes that required understanding of local politics, family alliances, and economic considerations that affected entire communities. They learned to evaluate different options not just for their immediate effects but for their long-term consequences on community welfare and social harmony. These decisions often involved life and death choices about resource allocation, conflict resolution, and survival strategies. The tool-making skills that medieval children developed included not just the ability to create functional implements, but also the knowledge of how to maintain, repair, and modify tools throughout their useful lives. They learned to work with wood, metal, leather, and stone, using techniques that had been refined over generations, understanding that well-made tools could mean the difference between successful and failed attempts at essential tasks. Medieval children learned to function within gift economies that operated alongside monetary systems, understanding that many transactions were based on reciprocal obligations and social relationships rather than immediate payment. They learned to evaluate the social implications of various exchanges, understanding that economic relationships were inseparable from social and political connections that affected their family's welfare and community standing. The seasonal migration patterns that some medieval families followed required children to develop adaptability and resilience that allowed them to function in multiple environments and social situations. They learned to quickly assess new communities, understand different local customs, and integrate themselves into temporary social networks while maintaining their family connections and cultural identity. Medieval children developed remarkable abilities to function with minimal artificial lighting, learning to work and navigate in conditions that modern children would find impossibly dark. They understood how to maximize the effectiveness of candles, oil lamps, and firelight, and they learned to accomplish complex tasks using only natural light sources that were available for limited periods each day. The relationship between medieval children and their own education was shaped by the understanding that knowledge was a form of wealth that could improve their social position, but also create dangers if misused or misunderstood. They learned to approach new information cautiously, understanding that certain types of knowledge were considered dangerous or heretical by religious and political authorities. Medieval children participated in complex food sharing systems that ensured community survival during periods of scarcity, while also reinforcing social hierarchies and family obligations. They learned to evaluate their own hunger against the needs of others, understanding that individual desires for food had to be balanced against community welfare and family survival strategies. The seasonal work rhythms that governed medieval life required children to develop physical and psychological stamina that allowed them to work intensively during crucial periods while also conserving energy during slower seasons. They learned to pace themselves according to natural cycles rather than artificial schedules, understanding that their effectiveness during peak work periods could determine their family's survival through lean times. Medieval children developed a sophisticated understanding of plant identification and usage that included not just edible species, but also plants used for medicine, crafts, and various household purposes. They learned to recognize hundreds of different plants in various stages of growth and seasonal condition, understanding that misidentification could lead to poisoning, missed opportunities for nutrition, or inadequate materials for essential household tasks. The relationship between medieval children and their own possessions was shaped by scarcity and the understanding that material objects were precious resources that had to be carefully maintained and protected. They learned to care for their few belongings with extraordinary attention, understanding that loss or damage of essential items could create hardships that affected their entire families. Medieval children learned to interpret the complex social meanings embedded in clothing, jewellery, and personal decoration that communicated information about social status, family connections, and individual circumstances. They understood that their appearance conveyed messages about their family's economic condition and social position, and they learned to manage their appearance strategically to create appropriate impressions in different social situations. The seasonal hunting and gathering activities that medieval children participated in required understanding of animal behaviour, plant cycles, and environmental conditions that allowed them to contribute significantly to their family's food supplies. They learned to track animals, identify edible plants at different stages of growth, and recognise the seasonal patterns that determined when different resources would be available. Medieval children developed remarkable abilities to repair and maintain the few possessions they owned, learning techniques for extending the useful life of clothing, tools, and household specifications. They learned to work items far beyond their original design with whatever materials were available, creating innovative solutions to practical problems, using scraps, waste materials, and damaged items that others might have discarded. The relationship between medieval children and community celebrations was shaped by understanding that festivities were not just entertainment, but crucial social events that reinforced community bonds and provided rare opportunities for joy and abundance. They learnt their roles in various celebrations, understanding that their participation contributed to community morale and social cohesion during difficult periods. Medieval children learned to navigate the complex emotional landscapes created by constant loss, uncertainty, and hardship, while still maintaining the psychological resilience necessary for survival and contribution to their families and communities. They developed emotional regulation techniques that allowed them to function effectively despite experiencing traumas and stresses that modern children would find overwhelming. The seasonal storage and organisation systems that medieval families used required children to understand complex logistics of space utilisation, inventory management, and resource protection that ensured their survival through periods when fresh supplies were unavailable. They learned to maximise limited storage space, protect stored goods from pests and weather, and maintain accurate mental inventories of family resources. Medieval children developed sophisticated understanding of community conflict resolution systems that allowed them to navigate disputes and disagreements without escalating tensions that could threaten community survival. They learned diplomatic skills, mediation techniques, and social strategies that helped maintain community harmony despite the stresses and competition created by resource scarcity and survival pressures. The relationship between medieval children and their own futures was shaped by the understanding that their adult lives would likely involve the same hardships and limitations they experienced as children, but also by the hope that their contributions and sacrifices might create slightly better conditions for the next generation. They learned to work toward long-term goals that might not benefit them directly, but could improve their families' and communities' chances of survival and prosperity. Medieval children participated in complex systems of mutual aid and community support that ensured no family faced crises entirely alone, while also creating networks of obligation and reciprocity that bound communities together. They learned to evaluate their own needs against the needs of others, understanding that community welfare and individual survival were inseparably connected. The seasonal craft production activities that medieval children engaged in required understanding of complex technical processes and artistic traditions that connected their work to broader cultural values and economic systems. They learned not just how to create functional objects, but also how to imbue their work with aesthetic qualities that reflected their community's artistic traditions and spiritual beliefs. Medieval children developed remarkable abilities to function as parts of extended family networks that included multiple generations and complex relationships of blood marriage and adoption that created support systems, but also multiple layers of obligation and authority. They learned to navigate these relationships carefully, understanding that their behavior reflected on their entire extended family network. The relationship between medieval children and their own bodies was shaped by religious teachings that emphasized spiritual purity and physical discipline, rather than health and comfort. They learned to view their bodies as temporary vessels for their souls, understanding that physical pleasure and comfort were less important than spiritual preparation and moral development. Medieval children learned to recognize and respond to the subtle signs of social and economic change that could affect their family's welfare and community standing. They developed sensitivity to shifts in political power, economic conditions, and social relationships that allowed them to help their families adapt to changing circumstances and maintain their position within their communities. The seasonal resource management strategies that medieval families employed required children to understand complex relationships between immediate needs and long-term survival that influenced every aspect of their daily lives. They learned to evaluate short-term sacrifices against long-term benefits, understanding that decisions made during abundant periods could determine their survival during scarce times. Medieval children developed sophisticated understanding of the natural cycles that governed agricultural production, animal husbandry, and resource availability that allowed them to participate effectively in the complex planning and preparation activities that ensured their family's survival. They learned to think in terms of annual cycles, understanding how decisions made during one season would affect conditions during subsequent seasons. The relationship between medieval children and their own creativity was shaped by the understanding that innovation and artistic expression were valuable only insofar as they contributed to practical survival needs or community welfare. They learned to channel their creative impulses into functional activities, understanding that purely aesthetic or self-expressive activities were luxuries that their circumstances rarely allowed. Medieval children participated in complex information networks that allowed communities to share crucial knowledge about weather conditions, resource availability, political changes, and other factors that affected survival and welfare. They learned to evaluate information critically, understanding that inaccurate information could lead to disastrous decisions, and that reliable information was a valuable resource that had to be carefully managed and shared. The seasonal health management strategies that medieval families employed required children to understand the relationships between environmental conditions, dietary changes, and physical wellness that allowed them to maintain their health despite primitive medical care and challenging living conditions. They learned to recognize early signs of illness, understand preventive measures, and make lifestyle adjustments that maximized their chances of staying healthy through difficult periods. Medieval children developed remarkable abilities to find meaning and purpose in lives that were characterized by hardship, limitation, and constant struggle for survival. They learned to derive satisfaction from small accomplishments, to find joy in rare moments of abundance or celebration, and to maintain hope despite facing circumstances that modern children would find utterly discouraging. The relationship between medieval children and their communities was characterized by interdependence and mutual responsibility that created both security and obligation in ways that modern individualistic societies can barely comprehend. They learned that their welfare was inseparable from community welfare, understanding that their individual success was meaningful only within the context of community survival and prosperity. Medieval children learned to function within economic systems that were based on barter, reciprocal obligation, and seasonal variation rather than monetary exchange, and consistent pricing that allowed them to participate effectively in the complex trading relationships that sustained their communities. They developed sophisticated understanding of value, scarcity, and exchange that enabled them to contribute to their family's economic welfare despite their youth and limited resources. The seasonal psychological adjustments that medieval children made in response to changing environmental conditions and survival pressures required remarkable emotional resilience and adaptability that allowed them to maintain their mental health despite facing stresses and challenges that would overwhelm modern children. They learned to regulate their emotions according to seasonal demands, understanding that their psychological welfare was secondary to their family's survival needs. Medieval children developed intimate knowledge of their local environments that included understanding of terrain, water sources, weather patterns, plant and animal life, and seasonal changes that allowed them to navigate their world safely and effectively. This knowledge was based on constant observation and interaction with natural systems rather than theoretical study, creating deep connections with their physical environment that modern children rarely experience. The relationship between medieval children and their own potential was shaped by social structures and economic limitations that predetermine most aspects of their adult lives, while still allowing for small variations and improvements that could significantly affect their welfare and social position. They learned to work within these constraints, while still striving for whatever advancement might be possible within their circumstances. Medieval children participated in complex systems of knowledge transmission that preserved and passed on essential cultural information, practical skills, and community wisdom through oral tradition, apprenticeship, and direct participation in community activities. They understood their role as links in chains of cultural continuity that connected past and future generations, accepting responsibility for preserving and transmitting the knowledge that would ensure their community's survival. The educational opportunities available to medieval children varied dramatically depending on their social class, but even the most privileged young people received instruction that would seem harsh and restrictive by modern standards. For the vast majority of children, formal education simply didn't exist. They learned what they needed to know through direct observation and hands-on experience, absorbing knowledge through their daily participation in family and community activities rather than through systematic instruction or theoretical study. The few children who did receive formal schooling found themselves in environments that prioritized obedience and memorization over creativity or critical thinking. Medieval educators believed that knowledge was a fixed body of information to be absorbed rather than a set of skills to be developed or problems to be solved. Students spent long hours copying Latin texts they couldn't fully understand, reciting prayers and passages from memory, and submitting to physical punishment when their performance failed to meet expectations. The teaching methods employed in medieval schools would be considered abusive by modern standards. Teachers regularly beat students for minor infractions, believing that physical pain was essential for proper learning and character development. The educational philosophy of the time held that children were naturally inclined towards sin and laziness, requiring constant correction and harsh discipline to develop into proper adults. Learning was viewed as a painful but necessary process that should be endured rather than enjoyed. For children of noble families, education served primarily to prepare them for their predetermined social roles rather than to develop their individual talents or interests. Boys learnt the basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic alongside training in warfare, hunting, and courtly etiquette. Girls received instruction in household management, needlework, music, and the social graces necessary for navigating aristocratic society. Both boys and girls understood that their education was designed to serve family interests rather than personal fulfillment. The apprenticeship system that governed craft education created relationships between masters and students that were often exploitative and harsh. Young apprentices, some as young as 7 years old, were bound to their masters for periods ranging from 7 to 14 years. During this time, they worked long hours for minimal compensation, enduring physical punishment and verbal abuse while slowly learning the complex skills of their chosen trades. The legal documents that governed apprenticeships gave masters almost unlimited authority over their young charges. Masters could beat apprentices for perceived laziness or disobedience, could restrict their movements and social contacts, and could extend their terms of service as punishment for various infractions. Apprentices had virtually no legal recourse against masters who abused their authority, and running away from an apprenticeship was considered a serious crime that could result in imprisonment or other severe penalties. The living conditions that apprentices endured were often squalid and dangerous. They typically slept in workshops or storage areas, sharing cramped quarters with other apprentices and sometimes with the master's family. They ate whatever food was provided, which was often inadequate in quantity and poor in quality. They worked with dangerous tools and toxic materials without safety equipment or proper training, resulting in frequent injuries and long-term health problems. The social isolation that apprentices experienced was particularly difficult for children who had been separated from their families at young ages. They were forbidden from marrying or forming romantic relationships during their terms of service, and their contact with family members was severely restricted. Many apprentices went years without seeing their parents or siblings, creating emotional trauma that affected their development and relationships throughout their lives. The knowledge that apprentices gained through their training was valuable, but it came at enormous personal cost. They learned complex technical skills that could provide them with economic security as adults, but they sacrificed their childhoods and often their health to acquire this knowledge. Many apprentices emerged from their training physically damaged, emotionally scarred, and socially isolated, struggling to form normal relationships and integrate into their communities. The guild systems that controlled craft production created additional barriers and challenges for young people trying to learn trades. Guilds limited the number of new members they would accept, often requiring substantial fees or political connections that poor families couldn't provide. Even apprentices who successfully completed their training might find themselves unable to practice their trades if they couldn't gain guild membership or establish themselves in communities that already had sufficient craftsmen. The religious education that all medieval children received emphasized fear, guilt, and absolute obedience rather than love, compassion, or spiritual growth. Children learned detailed descriptions of hell and eternal punishment, understanding that their immortal souls were constantly in danger from sin and temptation. They memorized prayers and religious formulas without necessarily understanding their meaning, participating in rituals that were designed to inspire awe and submission rather than personal connection with the divine. The moral instruction that accompanied religious education focused on the suppression of individual desires and the acceptance of suffering as divinely ordained. Children learned that questioning authority was sinful, that pleasure was dangerous, and that their primary goal should be preparing for death and judgment. This created psychological frameworks that emphasized duty and sacrifice over happiness and personal fulfillment, shaping their approaches to relationships and decision-making throughout their lives. The superstitious beliefs that medieval children absorbed along with their religious instruction created additional layers of fear and anxiety in their daily lives. They learned to interpret natural phenomena through supernatural frameworks, understanding that illness, accidents, and misfortunes were often attributed to divine punishment or demonic influence. This created constant psychological pressure to maintain perfect moral and religious behavior, knowing that any transgression might result in catastrophic consequences. The gender-specific education that medieval children received reinforced strict social hierarchies and limited their options for adult roles. Boys learned that their value came from their ability to provide economic support and protection for their families, while girls learned that their worth depended on their ability to bear children and manage households. Both boys and girls understood that deviation from these prescribed roles could result in social ostracism and economic hardship. The practical skills that medieval children learned through informal education were often more valuable than the formal instruction available to their more privileged peers. Peasant children developed sophisticated understanding of agriculture, animal husbandry, and crafts that enabled them to survive and contribute to their community's welfare. They learned to solve practical problems using available resources, to work cooperatively with others, and to adapt to changing circumstances in ways that formally educated children often couldn't match. The oral traditions that preserved and transmitted knowledge in medieval society placed enormous responsibility on children to remember and accurately repeat complex information. They served as living libraries, memorizing stories, songs, genealogies, and practical knowledge that might otherwise be lost. This created pressure to develop exceptional memory skills, but it also meant that children had access to rich cultural traditions that connected them to their ancestral heritage. The language skills that medieval children developed were often multilingual and sophisticated, despite their lack of formal linguistic education. They learned to communicate with people from different regions and social classes, understanding the subtle variations in dialect and vocabulary that could mean the difference between successful and failed interactions. They developed sensitivity to verbal and non-verbal communication cues that allowed them to navigate complex social situations effectively. The mathematical knowledge that medieval children acquired through practical experience was often more advanced than what they would have learned in formal schools. They understood concepts of measurement, proportion, and calculation through their participation in trade, construction, and agricultural activities. They learned to estimate quantities, calculate costs, and manage resources in ways that required sophisticated numerical reasoning, despite their lack of theoretical mathematical training. The technological understanding that medieval children developed through hands-on experience gave them intimate knowledge of how various tools, machines, and processes functioned. They learned to operate and maintain complex equipment, understand the properties of different materials, and solve engineering problems using principles they discovered through trial and error rather than theoretical study. The artistic skills that medieval children developed were typically integrated into practical activities rather than pursued as separate aesthetic endeavours. They learned to create beautiful as well as functional objects, understanding that craftsmanship involved both technical competence and aesthetic sensibility. They developed sophisticated appreciation for colour, form and design through their participation in textile production, metalworking, and other crafts. The musical education that some medieval children received served multiple purposes beyond simple entertainment or cultural enrichment. Music was used for religious worship, work coordination, and community celebration, requiring children to understand complex rhythmic and melodic patterns. They learned to sing, play instruments, and participate in group musical activities that strengthened community bonds and preserved cultural traditions. The storytelling skills that medieval children developed were essential for preserving and transmitting cultural knowledge in societies that relied heavily on oral tradition. They learned to memorize long narratives, understand symbolic and allegorical meanings, and adapt stories for different audiences and occasions. These skills required sophisticated understanding of language, psychology, and cultural values that served them throughout their adult lives. The social skills that medieval children developed through constant community interaction were often more advanced than those of modern children who grow up with greater privacy and individual space. They learn to navigate complex group dynamics, understand subtle social cues, and maintain relationships with people of different ages, social classes, and personality types. These skills were essential for survival in communities where cooperation and mutual support were necessary for everyone's welfare. The emotional regulation techniques that medieval children learned were designed to help them cope with constant stress, loss, and uncertainty rather than to promote individual happiness or self-expression. They learned to suppress displays of emotion that might be seen as weakness or self-indulgence, to find meaning in suffering and sacrifice, and to maintain hope despite facing circumstances that would seem hopeless by modern standards. The decision-making skills that medieval children developed were shaped by the understanding that individual choices had consequences not just for themselves, but for others as well, themselves, but for their entire families and communities. They learned to consider multiple factors and long-term implications when making decisions, understanding that mistakes could have devastating effects on people they cared about. This created decision-making frameworks that emphasized caution, consultation, and collective welfare over individual preferences. The leadership abilities that some medieval children developed were based on their understanding of community needs and their ability to coordinate group activities rather than on charisma or personal ambition. They learned to organize work projects, resolve conflicts, and motivate others to contribute to common goals. These leadership skills were often informal and situation-specific rather than recognized through formal titles or positions. The negotiation skills that medieval children developed through their participation in trade and community decision-making processes were sophisticated and culturally specific. They learned to understand different perspectives, find mutually beneficial solutions to conflicts, and build consensus around difficult decisions. These skills were essential for maintaining community harmony and ensuring that resources were distributed fairly during times of scarcity. The innovation abilities that medieval children developed were focused on solving practical problems using available resources rather than on creating entirely new technologies or systems. They learned to adapt existing tools and techniques to new situations, to combine different approaches in creative ways, and to develop incremental improvements that could significantly affect efficiency and effectiveness. The risk assessment skills that medieval children developed were crucial for survival in environments where poor decisions could have fatal consequences. They learned to evaluate potential dangers, weigh costs and benefits of different actions, and make calculated decisions about when to take chances and when to play it safe. These skills required understanding of probability, consequence, and risk management that was sophisticated despite being based on intuition rather than formal analysis. The resource management abilities that medieval children developed were essential for survival in societies where waste was literally unaffordable and scarcity was a constant reality. They learned to maximize the value of limited resources, to find multiple uses for single items, and to plan ahead for periods when resources might be unavailable. These skills required sophisticated understanding of conservation, efficiency, and long-term planning. The adaptation strategies that medieval children learned enabled them to cope with constantly changing circumstances and unexpected challenges. They developed flexibility and resilience that allowed them to adjust their expectations, modify their approaches, and maintain their effectiveness despite facing conditions that were often unpredictable and harsh. These adaptation skills were essential for survival in environments where change was constant and often dangerous. The collaboration techniques that medieval children mastered were necessary for participating effectively in communities where individual survival depended on group cooperation. They learned to work with others despite personality conflicts and competing interests, to contribute their fair share to group efforts, and to support community goals even when they conflicted with personal preferences. These collaboration skills were essential for maintaining the social cohesion necessary for community survival. The observation skills that medieval children developed were remarkably acute and detailed, enabling them to gather crucial information about their environment, other people, and changing conditions that might affect their welfare. They learn to notice subtle details that others might miss, to interpret complex patterns and relationships, and to use observational data to make informed decisions about various aspects of their lives. The communication abilities that medieval children developed enabled them to share information effectively across barriers of age, social class, and cultural difference. They learned to adapt their communication styles to different audiences, to convey complex information clearly and persuasively, and to understand the subtle meanings embedded in various forms of verbal and non-verbal communication. The problem-solving approaches that medieval children learned were practical and resource-focused rather than theoretical or abstract. They learned to identify the root causes of problems, to generate creative solutions using available materials and knowledge, and to implement solutions effectively despite facing significant constraints and limitations. These problem-solving skills were essential for navigating the constant challenges of medieval life. The planning abilities that medieval children developed were focused on practical preparation for predictable challenges rather than abstract goal setting or long-term visioning. They learned to anticipate future needs, to prepare resources and strategies for dealing with expected difficulties, and to coordinate their activities with others to maximize efficiency and effectiveness. These planning skills were crucial for survival in societies where adequate preparation often meant the difference between life and death. The evaluation skills that medieval children learned enabled them to assess the quality, value, and effectiveness of various people, objects, and situations they encountered. They learned to make accurate judgments about trustworthiness, competence, and reliability that could affect their safety and welfare. These evaluation skills required sophisticated understanding of human nature, material properties, and situational dynamics. The memory techniques that medieval children developed were essential for functioning in societies that relied heavily on oral tradition and had limited access to written records. They learned to memorize vast amounts of information accurately, to organize knowledge in ways that made it easy to retrieve, and to use various mnemonic devices and association techniques that enhanced their ability to retain and recall important information. The concentration abilities that medieval children developed enabled them to focus intensely on tasks and activities despite facing numerous distractions and interruptions. They learned to maintain their attention for extended periods, to block out irrelevant stimuli, and to perform complex tasks that required sustained mental effort. These concentration skills were necessary for mastering the demanding crafts and activities that characterized medieval life. The physical coordination skills that medieval children developed through constant manual labor and practical activities were often extraordinary by modern standards. They learned to perform delicate tasks with precision, to coordinate complex movements involving multiple body parts, and to maintain their physical effectiveness despite fatigue and discomfort. These coordination skills were essential for the demanding physical work that characterized most medieval occupations. The endurance capabilities that medieval children developed enabled them to maintain their effectiveness through extended periods of physical and mental stress that would overwhelm most modern children. They learned to pace themselves appropriately, to conserve energy for crucial tasks, and to push through fatigue and discomfort when necessary. These endurance capabilities were essential for survival in societies where physical demands were constant and relentless. The relationship between medieval children and their own learning was fundamentally different from modern educational experiences. They understood that knowledge was a tool for survival rather than an end in itself, that learning required sacrifice and hardship, and that their education was designed to serve community needs rather than individual fulfillment. This created approaches to learning that were practical, disciplined, and focused on immediate application rather than theoretical understanding or personal enrichment. Medieval children also learned to navigate educational systems that were often corrupt, inefficient, and politically motivated rather than genuinely focused on student welfare or learning outcomes. They understood that educational opportunities were scarce and precious, that access to knowledge was often controlled by powerful interests, and that their educational experiences would largely determine their adult opportunities and social positions. The relationship between medieval children and intellectual authority was characterized by absolute submission and unquestioning acceptance rather than critical thinking or independent analysis. They learned that challenging established knowledge was dangerous and potentially heretical, that their role was to absorb and repeat information rather than to question or evaluate it, and that intellectual curiosity should be carefully controlled and directed toward approved subjects and methods. The seasonal rhythms that governed medieval education meant that children's learning opportunities varied dramatically depending on agricultural cycles, weather conditions, and family economic needs. They understood that formal education was a luxury that could be interrupted or terminated at any time due to practical necessities, and that their primary educational experiences would come through participation in seasonal work activities rather than through consistent classroom instruction. Medieval children learned to value different types of knowledge and skills according to their practical utility and social acceptability rather than their intrinsic interest or intellectual merit. They understood that certain subjects were considered appropriate for their social class and gender, while others were forbidden or irrelevant, and they learned to focus their limited educational time and energy on knowledge that would serve their predetermined social roles. The relationship between medieval children and their teachers was characterized by fear, respect, and emotional distance rather than warmth, encouragement, or personal connection. They learned that teachers were authority figures to be obeyed rather than mentors to be trusted, that educational relationships were formal and hierarchical rather than collaborative or supportive, and that their personal feelings and preferences were irrelevant to the educational process. Medieval children understood that their educational experiences would largely determine not just their individual futures, but also their family's social and economic welfare. They learned that educational failure could have devastating consequences for their entire extended family networks, that educational success could improve their family's social position, and that their educational choices and achievements reflected on their community's values and capabilities. The competitive aspects of medieval education were often brutal and unforgiving, creating environments where children learned that their educational achievements came at the expense of their peers rather than through collaborative effort or mutual support. They understood that educational resources were scarce and that their success might mean that others would be denied opportunities, creating psychological pressures and social tensions that affected their relationships with other children. The relationship between medieval children and books, when they had access to written materials, was characterized by reverence and careful handling, rather than casual use or personal ownership. They learned that books were precious objects that represented enormous investments of time and resources, that mishandling written materials could result in severe punishment, and that their access to written knowledge was a privilege that could be withdrawn at any time. Medieval children who did learn to read and write understood that literacy was a powerful but potentially dangerous skill that could improve their social position, but also expose them to accusations of heresy, witchcraft, or political subversion. They learned to use their literacy carefully and discreetly, understanding that inappropriate use of reading and writing skills could result in serious legal and social consequences. The relationship between medieval children and intellectual creativity was shaped by religious and social constraints that severely limited them to explore new ideas or express individual perspectives. They learned that creativity should be channeled into approved activities and subjects, that innovation was dangerous unless it served established authorities, and that their intellectual contributions should support, rather than challenge, existing social and religious structures. Medieval children understood that their educational experiences were temporary, and that their primary learning would occur through adult work and family responsibilities rather than through extended periods of formal study. They learned to make the most of limited educational opportunities, to focus on immediately practical knowledge and skills, and to prepare themselves for adult roles that would require different types of competencies than those emphasized in formal educational settings. The assessment methods used in medieval education emphasized memorization and obedience rather than understanding or creative application of knowledge. Children learned that their educational success would be measured by their ability to repeat information accurately and behave appropriately, rather than by their ability to think independently or solve complex problems. This created learning approaches that prioritize conformity and submission over intellectual development or personal growth. Medieval children who showed exceptional intellectual abilities often found that their talents created additional burdens and dangers rather than opportunities for advancement. They learned that being too smart or too curious could attract unwanted attention from religious or political authorities, that intellectual gifts might separate them from their communities, and that their abilities might be exploited by others rather than used for their own benefit. The relationship between medieval children and foreign languages was shaped by the practical needs of trade and travel rather than cultural curiosity or intellectual enrichment. They learned that linguistic skills were valuable tools for economic advancement and social mobility, but they also understood that speaking foreign languages could create suspicion about their loyalty and religious orthodoxy. Medieval children understood that their educational experiences would be constantly interrupted by family crises, economic necessities, and community emergencies that took precedence over learning activities. They learned to be flexible about their educational goals and timelines, to make the most of irregular learning opportunities, and to continue their education through informal channels when formal instruction was unavailable. The relationship between medieval children and their own intellectual development was shaped by the understanding that their minds belonged to their communities and families rather than to themselves as individuals. They learned that their intellectual growth should serve collective needs rather than personal satisfaction, that their thinking should conform to established patterns rather than explore new possibilities, and that their mental capabilities were resources to be used for community welfare rather than personal fulfillment. Medieval children learned that their educational achievements were measured not by personal growth or intellectual curiosity, but by their ability to contribute immediately to family survival and community welfare. A child who could memorize prayers perfectly but couldn't identify poisonous plants was considered poorly educated, regardless of their religious knowledge. They understood that practical wisdom trumped theoretical learning every single time, and that their education was complete only when they could function as fully contributing members of their harsh world. The transition from childhood learning to adult responsibility happened with breathtaking suddenness that left no room for gradual adjustment or experimental phases. One day, a child might be learning to weave simple patterns under their mother's guidance, and the next day they could find themselves responsible for producing textiles that would determine whether their family had adequate clothing for winter. There were no practice periods, no second chances, no allowances for inexperience when survival hung in the balance. Medieval children discovered that their educational experiences were constantly shaped by the brutal realities of social hierarchy that determined not just what they could learn, but whether they would live long enough to use that knowledge. A peasant child who showed exceptional intelligence might catch the attention of local authorities, but this attention was as likely to result in exploitation or suspicion as in educational opportunity. They learned that being too smart could be as dangerous as being too ignorant, and that the safest path was often to demonstrate just enough competence to be useful without becoming threatening. The seasonal nature of medieval education meant that children's learning opportunities expanded and contracted according to agricultural cycles and weather conditions that were completely beyond human control. During harvest time, even the most promising students found their formal education suspended while they joined the desperate race to gather crops before weather destroyed them. During winter months, educational activities might resume, but only if families had adequate fuel and food to support non-productive activities. Medieval children understood that their access to education could be terminated instantly by family crisis, economic disaster, or political upheaval that swept away whatever stability had made learning possible. They learned to absorb knowledge quickly and efficiently, knowing that today's educational opportunity might not exist tomorrow. This created intense pressure to make the most of every learning moment, while also accepting that their education would always be incomplete and interrupted. The relationship between medieval children and their own intellectual potential was complicated by the understanding that developing their minds too fully might actually reduce their chances of survival and social acceptance. Communities that were struggling to meet basic survival needs often viewed intellectual pursuits with suspicion, seeing them as wasteful distractions from essential work. Children learned to hide their intelligence when necessary, and to express it only in ways that served immediate community needs. Medieval children who did receive formal education often found that their teachers were themselves barely literate, working from incomplete knowledge and outdated information that reflected the intellectual limitations of their isolated communities. They learned to respect authority figures who might know less than they did, understanding that challenging their teacher's ignorance could result in severe punishment, regardless of whether their corrections were accurate. The physical conditions in which medieval education took place were often so harsh and uncomfortable that they interfered significantly with learning processes and intellectual development. Children attended lessons in unheated buildings during winter, struggled to see written materials by inadequate candlelight, and tried to concentrate despite hunger, cold, and various physical discomforts that would be considered unacceptable barriers to learning by modern standards. Medieval children learned that their educational experiences would be constantly interrupted by religious obligations that took precedence over all other learning activities. They might be in the middle of mastering a crucial skill when called away for lengthy religious services, seasonal celebrations, or spiritual observances that consumed days or weeks of their limited educational time. They understood that their intellectual development was always secondary to their spiritual welfare. The competitive dynamics that characterized medieval education often pitted children against their own siblings and community members in ways that damaged family relationships and social cohesion. Educational resources were so scarce that one child's access to learning often meant that others would be denied similar opportunities. This created family tensions and community conflicts that affected children's emotional development and social relationships throughout their lives. Medieval children understood that their educational achievements would be constantly evaluated, not just for their individual merit, but for their reflection on their family's social status and moral character. A child who excelled in learning brought honor to their entire family network, while educational failures could damage their relatives' reputations and social standing. This created enormous pressure to succeed academically, despite facing significant obstacles and limitations. The relationship between medieval children and written knowledge was complicated by the understanding that literacy could expose them to ideas and information that authorities considered dangerous or heretical. They learned that reading the wrong books or expressing interest in prohibited subjects could result in accusations of witchcraft, heresy, or political subversion. Educational curiosity had to be carefully balanced against personal safety and social acceptability. Medieval children who showed artistic or creative talents often found that their abilities were valued only insofar as they could be channeled into practical applications that served community needs. A child with musical ability might be encouraged to develop these skills for religious services or community celebrations, but purely aesthetic or self-expressive activities were considered wasteful luxuries that detracted from essential survival work. The evaluation methods used in medieval education were often arbitrary and unfair, reflecting the personal biases and limited knowledge of teachers rather than objective assessments of student ability or achievement. Children learn to navigate educational systems where favoritism, prejudice, and political considerations often mattered more than actual learning or competence. They understood that educational success depended as much on social connections and political awareness as on intellectual ability. Medieval children learned that their educational experiences would be shaped by gender expectations that severely limited their learning opportunities and directed their intellectual development toward predetermined social roles. Boys and girls were taught different subjects, held to different standards, and prepared for entirely different adult responsibilities, regardless of their individual talents or interests. Educational equality was literally unimaginable within medieval social structures. The relationship between medieval children and their own learning disabilities or intellectual challenges was characterized by ignorance and superstition that often made educational difficulties worse rather than better. Children who struggled with learning were often assumed to be lazy, morally deficient, or possessed by evil spirits, rather than suffering from conditions that could be addressed through appropriate educational modifications or medical treatments. Medieval children understood that their educational experiences would be constantly disrupted by community crises that required all available human resources to address immediate survival needs. Epidemics, famines, wars, and natural disasters could instantly transform educational institutions into emergency shelters, medical facilities, or refugee centres, ending formal learning activities for months or years at a time. The social dynamics that surrounded medieval education created environments where children learned as much about power, authority, and social manipulation as they did about academic subjects. They observed how educational resources were distributed according to political considerations, how knowledge was used as a tool of social control, and how intellectual achievements could be exploited by others for personal or political gain. Medieval children learned that their access to advanced education would be determined not by their intellectual ability or personal motivation, but by their families' economic resources and social connections. Exceptional students from poor families might never have opportunities to develop their talents, while mediocre students from wealthy families could access educational resources that were denied to their more capable peers from lower social classes. The relationship between medieval children and educational authority figures was complicated by the understanding that many teachers were themselves products of limited educational systems that emphasized conformity and obedience over intellectual development or creative thinking. They learned to navigate educational relationships with people who might punish them for asking questions, expressing curiosity, or demonstrating intellectual independence. Medieval children who received multilingual education often found that their language skills created both opportunities and dangers that affected their social position and personal safety. Speaking multiple languages could provide economic advantages in trading communities, but it could also attract suspicion about foreign loyalties or heretical influences. They learned to use their linguistic abilities carefully and strategically rather than openly displaying their multilingual competence. The seasonal rhythms that governed medieval life created educational patterns that were completely different from modern academic calendars, with learning opportunities clustering around winter months when agricultural work was minimal, and scattering during growing seasons when every family member was needed for essential survival work. Children learned to maximize their educational progress during limited windows of opportunity while accepting that their formal learning would be interrupted for months at a time. Medieval children understood that their educational experiences would be constantly influenced by religious and political authorities who used educational institutions to promote their own agendas rather than to serve student welfare or intellectual development. They learned to recognize when their education was being used for indoctrination purposes and to navigate carefully between genuine learning opportunities and propaganda activities. The relationship between medieval children and their own intellectual curiosity was shaped by social expectations that discouraged questioning, exploration, and independent thinking in favor of acceptance, obedience, and conformity to established patterns of thought and behavior. They learned that intellectual curiosity could be dangerous if it led them to challenge accepted beliefs or authority structures, and that their questions should be carefully limited to safe and approved subjects. Medieval children learned that their educational achievements would have consequences not just for their own futures, but for their entire extended family networks and community relationships. Educational success could improve their family's social standing and economic opportunities, while educational failures could damage their relatives' reputations and reduce their access to community resources and support systems. The physical demands of medieval life meant that children's educational experiences were constantly interrupted by health problems, injuries, and physical exhaustion that interfered with their ability to concentrate and learn effectively. They learned to pursue education despite dealing with chronic hunger, untreated illnesses, and various physical disabilities that would be considered significant barriers to learning by modern educational standards. Medieval children understood that their access to educational materials and resources would be severely limited by economic constraints that affected not just their own families, but their entire communities. Books were rare and expensive, writing materials were precious commodities, and even basic educational supplies, like candles for reading, were luxury items that many families couldn't afford on a regular basis. The relationship between medieval children and educational innovation was characterized by suspicion and resistance to change that reflected broader social patterns of conservatism and tradition. They learned that educational methods and content were considered fixed and unchangeable, that suggesting improvements or modifications could be interpreted as dangerous challenges to established authority, and that their role was to accept rather than improve their educational experiences. Medieval children who showed exceptional academic promise often found that their talents created additional burdens and responsibilities that interfered with their personal development and family relationships. They might be pressed into service as teachers for younger children, scribes for illiterate adults, or intermediaries in community disputes that required literacy skills, taking time and energy away from their own educational development. The relationship between medieval children and their own educational goals was shaped by the understanding that personal ambition and individual achievement were less important than family welfare and community needs. They learned to subordinate their own educational interests to the collective requirements of their social groups. Understanding that pursuing personal intellectual development at the expense of family responsibilities was considered selfish and inappropriate. Medieval children learned that their educational experiences would be constantly evaluated by community members who had little understanding of learning processes or educational methodology, but strong opinions about appropriate behaviour and social conformity. They understood that their academic performance would be judged as much by their adherence to social expectations as by their intellectual achievements. The seasonal nature of medieval economic activity meant that children's educational opportunities were directly tied to their families' financial success or failure during crucial agricultural periods. A good harvest might provide resources for winter education, while crop failures could eliminate any possibility of formal learning for entire seasons or years. Children learned that their access to education was always uncertain and dependent on factors beyond their control. Medieval children understood that their educational experiences would be shaped by the limited worldview and provincial perspectives of their teachers and communities, who often had little knowledge of developments in other regions or cultures. They learned that their education would be narrow and parochial rather than broad and cosmopolitan, preparing them for life within their immediate communities rather than for participation in larger cultural or intellectual movements. The relationship between medieval children and educational discipline was characterized by the understanding that physical punishment was not just acceptable, but necessary for proper character development and academic achievement. They learned to expect and endure beatings for educational failures, understanding that their teachers' violence was considered evidence of caring rather than abuse, and that protesting harsh treatment would only result in more severe punishment. Medieval children learned that their educational achievements would be constantly compared to those of their peers in ways that created competition and resentment rather than collaboration and mutual support. Educational resources were so scarce that one child's success often came at the expense of others, creating social dynamics that encouraged secrecy, sabotage, and individual advancement rather than collective learning and shared achievement. The relationship between medieval children and their own learning potential was complicated by social beliefs about intelligence and ability that attributed academic success or failure to moral character rather than cognitive capacity or educational opportunity. They learned that being considered stupid was often preferable to being considered evil, and that demonstrating intellectual ability could attract unwanted attention from authorities who might interpret academic success as evidence of dangerous pride or heretical thinking. Medieval children understood that their educational experiences would be constantly interrupted by family obligations that took precedence over all learning activities, regardless of the importance or urgency of their academic work. They might be called away from crucial lessons to tend animals, help with household tasks, or participate in family economic activities that couldn't be postponed for educational purposes. The seasonal patterns of medieval social life meant that children's educational opportunities varied dramatically depending on community celebration schedules, religious observances, and economic cycles that were completely beyond individual or family control. They learned to make the most of educational windows while accepting that their formal learning would be constantly interrupted by social obligations and community requirements. Medieval children learned that their educational experiences would be shaped by the political tensions and social conflicts that affected their communities, with educational institutions often becoming battlegrounds for competing interests and ideologies. They understood that their access to education could be affected by wars, political upheavals, and social changes that had nothing to do with their individual merit or educational needs. The relationship between medieval children and educational technology was limited to basic tools like slate boards, quill pens, and crude writing materials that were expensive, difficult to maintain, and often inadequate for effective learning. They learned to make the most of primitive educational resources while understanding that their technological limitations would significantly affect their educational outcomes and opportunities. Medieval children understood that their educational experiences would be constantly evaluated by religious authorities who prioritized spiritual conformity over intellectual development, and who could terminate educational opportunities for students who showed signs of independent thinking or doctrinal deviation. They learned to balance genuine learning with the appearance of religious orthodoxy, understanding that their intellectual curiosity had to be carefully hidden if it led them toward unapproved conclusions. The relationship between medieval children and their own educational records was complicated by the fact that most educational achievements were never documented or officially recognized, making it difficult for students to demonstrate their learning or transfer their educational credits to other institutions or communities. They understood that their educational accomplishments existed primarily in memory and reputation, rather than in permanent records that could be verified or transferred. Medieval children learned that their educational experiences would be shaped by the chronic instability and uncertainty that characterized medieval life, with educational institutions often closing temporarily or permanently due to economic problems, political conflicts, or demographic changes that affected community viability. They understood that their access to formal education was always tenuous and could disappear without warning or explanation. The seasonal rhythms that governed medieval agriculture meant that children's educational progress followed irregular patterns that bore no resemblance to modern academic calendars, with intensive learning periods alternating with months of educational inactivity that could cause students to forget much of what they had previously learned. They developed strategies for retaining knowledge through periods of educational interruption, while accepting that their learning would always be fragmented and incomplete. Medieval children understood that their educational experiences would be constantly influenced by the superstitious beliefs and irrational fears of their communities, with learning opportunities often restricted by religious taboos, cultural prejudices, and supernatural concerns that had little connection to actual educational needs or intellectual development. They learned to navigate educational systems that were shaped more by superstition than by rational educational philosophy. The relationship between medieval children and educational assessment was characterized by evaluation methods that were often arbitrary, subjective, and influenced by factors that had nothing to do with actual learning or competence. They understood that their educational success would depend as much on their ability to please their teachers and conform to social expectations as on their actual knowledge or skills. Medieval children learned that their access to advanced educational opportunities would be determined not just by their individual abilities, but by complex social and political calculations that took into account their family's status, their community's needs, and their potential usefulness to various authority figures. They understood that educational advancement was as much about social networking and political positioning as about intellectual achievement. The relationship between medieval children and their own educational motivation was complicated by the understanding that personal interest and intellectual curiosity were less important than social obligation and family duty in determining their educational priorities and goals. They learned to find motivation in serving others rather than in satisfying their own intellectual interests, understanding that selfish educational pursuits were considered morally questionable. Medieval children understood that their educational experiences would be shaped by the endemic violence and social conflict that characterized medieval society, with educational institutions often becoming targets for military action, political repression, or social unrest that could destroy years of educational investment and progress. They learned to value educational opportunities while understanding that their learning could be interrupted or destroyed by forces completely beyond their control. The seasonal patterns of medieval economic activity meant that children's educational funding came primarily from agricultural surpluses that varied dramatically from year to year, depending on weather conditions, crop yields, and market fluctuations. They understood that their access to educational resources would fluctuate according to economic cycles that were largely unpredictable and uncontrollable. Medieval children learned that their educational experiences would be constantly monitored by community members who had strong opinions about appropriate learning activities and who could influence or terminate their educational opportunities based on social conformity rather than educational merit. They understood that their academic progress would be evaluated as much for its social acceptability as for its intellectual value. The relationship between medieval children and educational specialization was limited by social expectations that required them to master a broad range of practical skills rather than developing expertise in particular subjects or areas of knowledge. They learned that their education should prepare them for general, adult responsibilities rather than for specialised careers or intellectual pursuits that might separate them from their communities. As we've journeyed through the harsh realities of medieval childhood, one truth becomes undeniably clear. These children lived lives that would break most modern spirits before breakfast. They faced mortality rates that turned every sunrise into a small miracle, worked with tools that could maim or kill them, and shouldered adult responsibilities while their bodies were still growing. They knew hunger as intimately as we know comfort, understood cold as a constant companion rather than a temporary inconvenience, and accepted pain as the natural rhythm of existence rather than a problem to be immediately solved. Yet somehow, against impossible odds and through sheer stubborn resilience, they endured. They created communities, preserved knowledge, and passed down the threads of civilization that eventually wove themselves into the world we inhabit today. Their stories remind us that childhood, as we understand it, is a modern luxury built upon centuries of sacrifice by small hands that never knew gentleness. But we're only halfway through their remarkable story of survival, ingenuity, and quiet courage that shaped the very foundations of our world.